What is the impact of October 7th, not only on the Middle East, but on global affairs?
I think that what October 7th did was it brought everything to the fore. It's important to remember the week before October 7th, when Netanyahu went to the United Nations, held up that map that had erased Palestine, when he talked about normalization being the greatest deal since the end of the Cold War, when the Israeli ambassador told Cannes Television that normalization with Saudi Arabia means the complete Arab abandonment of the Palestinians, when Erdogan, when he saw the Middle East corridor announced at the G20 in India only a few months back, that Biden celebrated and hailed, that would essentially connect India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel, and then enter into Europe. We saw Erdogan shake hands with Netanyahu for the first time since Erdogan came to power in 2003. There was this sense that the whole world was moving towards a normalization with Israel over the heads of the Palestinians in the way that King Abdullah of Jordan had put it. We saw the UAE, for example, coming out and effectively saying that normalization is no longer for the Palestinians. Yusuf al-Utaiba, the UAE ambassador, told, I think it was Brookings or Carnegie, when he was asked what has normalization achieved for the Palestinians, he said it hasn't achieved anything, as in UAE normalization. And he says now it's on the future countries that normalize with Israel to decide if they want to do something for the Palestinians. But don't fret, because now we have wonderful trade deals, and do you know how many flights there are now between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi? So October 7th happened in that particular context where the world looks like it's squeezing the Palestinians and hoping that this normalization over their heads will end the Palestinian cause in a way that favors the Israelis. And by that, what I mean is essentially rendering the Palestinians abandoned, hopeless, with no agency to continue with their cause or even insist on their cause. What October 7th demonstrated, and here I'm not justifying it or saying it was right, and I'm not making any comment on what about October 7th itself. What I'm saying is that what October 7th demonstrated was what Bloomberg and Erdogan and King Abdullah and all these other analysts had been saying, which is that you can't normalize ties over the heads of the Palestinians without risking a backlash. And Sisi himself is on record as having warned the Israelis that the way they were going about normalization, if you remember the report, they were saying that the Sisi had warned Netanyahu, there's something brewing in Gaza. And it's unclear whether he was warning them of October 7th or if he was telling them that Netanyahu, the way you're going about things, it's going to result in a backlash. You're underestimating. And that's why I think that what October 7th did, it brought everything to the fore. Even the idea of Netanyahu and his bid to annex, to expand the Israeli borders. There's a lot of focus on the Israelis and what they're doing in Gaza, and that October 7th was the beginning of a chain of events. But people forget that the week before October 7th, Netanyahu was moving the troops and units around to position them near to the Jenin refugee camp and the West Bank in anticipation of a preparation to invade the West Bank and finally annex the territories. Remember, since 2019, he's been trying to annex, at least 2019. 2019, he tried. Trump told him don't do it so that UAE can normalize, so you give them some face to show the Muslim world and give time for UAE scholars to say that normalization is a good thing and to do all these interfaith things. And then when he wanted to go invade again, he fell out of power, and Naftali Bennett became prime minister. Naftali Bennett tried to invade, Jenin as well, began the raids. They killed Shireen Abu Akleh in the process, which ruined it. Too much, heat. They had to stop the invasion. Netanyahu comes back to power and he wants to invade again. Now he's shaking hands with Erdogan. Now he's been to Saudi Arabia twice and met with bin Salman. Now that the UAE is saying Abraham Accords, we're not going back. Now that Sisi is more focused on domestic politics. Now that King Abdullah of Jordan is under pressure from the Saudis and the UAE to hand over custodianship of Al-Aqsa, Netanyahu believed this was the time to finally go into the Jenin refugee camp, go into the West Bank to invade. So what October 7th did was it categorically blew up the suggestion that there can be any resolution to the Middle East conflict without the participation of the Palestinians, without talking to the Palestinians, without having dialogue to the Palestinians. The second thing that October 7th did was expose the fallacy of international community's approach to Palestine and Israel. The idea being that even when you look at the normalization talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel, if you notice, they went from talking about normalization in exchange for a Palestinian state to normalization in exchange for a pathway to a Palestinian state. The same kind of language that they used in Oslo, the same kind of language that they used after the Second Intifada to sort of suggest that they're doing something without actually doing anything. What October 7th demonstrated or brought to the fore is also the fallacy of these, to the extent that the EU now is sort of operating on its own in terms of trying to present its ideas on the Palestine and Israel independently of the United States, which is why when we saw Cameron call for this idea that we might recognize a Palestinian state irrespective of the Israelis, Spain came out, said we're ready to recognize a Palestinian state. Macron said we're ready to recognize a ceasefire, we have to talk about a Palestinian state. I think when these European countries are saying saying it. It's a reflection that the Europeans are coming to a conclusion that the American and Israeli approach to the situation resulted in October 7th, and therefore there needs to be new eyes and a new way of approaching the Palestine-Israel issue. So I think these are the two main things that October 7th demonstrated. Of course, there are side things. I want to side things. They're also significant as well in terms of, media hypocrisy and the like. We saw, New York Times, at the time of the recording, we're recording one day after New York Times published that Thomas Friedman article that we talk about the Middle East in the same way that we're looking at, the animal kingdom and the like. But I think those two, in essence, the idea that Netanyahu was pushing for peace at the expense of the Palestinians. I think now people are saying that you can't have peace unless you talk to the Palestinians. Having said that, there are still attempts to install the Palestinian Authority into Gaza, which is still an idea of imposing, their own way onto the Palestinians. But I think that the difficulties that Blinken is finding in that, there was a report that Netanyahu asked bin Zayed, the UAE, وما أدراك, if the UAE could help with rebuilding Gaza. And bin Zayed is on record as telling Netanyahu, go ask Zelensky, because he's getting all this money from the Americans. You can't do all that damage and expect me to pay for it, because they're very frustrated with Netanyahu or the like. But the idea being that they're struggling to implement their way. But I think more broadly, those are the two main things. The idea you can't normalize at the expense of the Palestinians, and also the fallacy of the approach to Palestine-Israel, which is making what was once a united bloc behind Israel splinter off into different initiatives, which opens the door to a more in-depth discussion as to how exactly we should proceed on this.
Trust nothing. No